Hi, I'm Michael Moore, and this is Propology 101, and I hope we're propping up your imagination. Our guest today is Max Cervantes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Max Cervantes.
Max worked with me on Star Trek for many years, as well as so many other projects. So we're just going to get down to some of the questions now. What was your first prop you ever made that inspired you to follow this career path?
When I was probably a little kid in junior high school, maybe 8th grade, back then, schools, you could take lots of different classes like wood shop and metal shop. And this was in junior high school. I had wood shop and I got the idea because I love Star Trek, always have ever since I was little. And I made myself a hand phaser and a pistol phaser out of just junk. I remember on the pistol phaser, I just made it out of simple white pine in wood shop. I used the end cap of a tester's, the lid off a tester's bottle of paint as the emitter, and then I used a simple finish nail as the emitter tip, the part that's normally we would see as clear. And then for the hand phaser, I used a pencil sharpener. And I glued a couple rhinestones on it for the, indicator lights and such. And I just painted it up by the best I could. But, it was probably the very first thing prop-wise that I ever built for myself.
So how did you get started in the film industry?
I got started in the film industry through an odd occasion. When I was in high school, I was in a special program for kids that had higher IQs. In the 3rd grade, I tested out with the IQ of 135, and I believe 137 or 38 is considered genius. I got sent away to a private school run by the government for kids with higher IQs. When I was in high school, my counselor for this special program asked me what I wanted to do in my life. And I said, I love sci-fi movies, monster movies, horror movies. I love special effects stuff. And he said, well, give me a list of your favorite special effects movies. And I did. Top of the list, of course, was 2001, which was made by MGM, as most people know. My teacher, though, didn't know that, my special counselor didn't know that MGM was actually made at MGM Studios in England, not here in Los Angeles in Culver City. Nevertheless, he called up MGM Studios in Culver City, and next thing you know, December the 27th, 1976, I'm standing at the front gates of MGM Studios, and I got to tour all of MGM Studios with the gentleman who was at the time the head of MGM, Glenn Robinson. And he took me and 2 of my friends from school, and we got to see all of the standing sets that were there from Logan's Run. And that was what really cemented me that I wanted to do this. And near the end of the day, after seeing everything, he took us back to his office, which was just amazing, seeing all the stuff he had around his room. I asked him, why us? Why me, Mr. Robinson? He says, well, when I heard your story from your teacher, you reminded me of me when I was your age. And he then told me his story how his very first film he ever worked on at MGM was Forbidden Planet, and he started there when he was only 17, and he worked his whole career at MGM, and he was getting ready to retire that year. He later went on and won 2 Oscars that year, one for Logan's Run and the other one for King Kong. He had built the giant mechanical arm that could reach down and pick up people, and he won a special Oscar for that. And that was pretty much it, and he said, yeah, if you want to come back and visit, I might be gone by then, but my second in command is going to be here, Jimmy McLennan, and he introduced me to Mr. McLennan and such, and before we left, he then gave me an original crystal, and if I thought about it, I would have brought it for this, and I still have it to this day. And he said, we really didn't make many of these for the actors. We only made them, and they only wore them if we knew it was going to show in the scene. And all the vast extras you saw in the movie, the wardrobe department lined them up based on what color costume they were wearing, and they took a Sharpie and then just drew a disc of color in the palm of their hand with a Sharpie, and that was it. So this green crystal is probably either Jenny Agutter's or Farrah Fawcett Major's, and I'd like to prefer to think it was Jenny Agutter's, but again, I still have that crystal to this day, and that's what really set me on the road of wanting to work in the business.
So what were some of the other films you've worked on in the beginning of your career?
Well, like pretty much anybody of my age starting off in the business back in the middle and early 80s, I worked on a few low-budget movies. But my very first feature film I ever worked on that I got my name in was a film made by TriStar Productions named Real Genius, starring Val Kilmer. And that was really a great opportunity. I had gotten a job completely, again, just by having the balls to call a shop and just calling them up and say, hey, would you be willing to see my portfolio? And that shop was David Stipes Productions. And Dave is a wonderful guy, just wonderful, wonderful guy. He got his start working on the old Poppin' Fresh Doughboy commercials, which back then were all hand animated. And he had worked on those. And anyways, so I ended up working at his shop just by calling up and asking him if I could get an interview. And I showed him a couple of simple little things I had built for myself, and he liked it, and so he hired me. For Real Genius, the two main objects I worked on was at the end of the movie, there's a big SR-71 swing wing attack bomber that I built that's in the end of the movie. And then at the beginning of the movie, there's a small suborbital attack shuttle called, I think, the SR-71. And it was designed by Ron Cobb. And another model maker built the main model of it, the one you saw all of it. And I was busy because the way the storyboards were, they needed to have an extreme close-up of just the laser cannon area. And the filming miniature of the whole ship was only about 2.5, maybe 3 feet long, and it wasn't big enough in scale to shoot a really good close-up of that. So it was decided to build a big section of that model, which was probably about like that wide, the whole thing, and the laser turret in the middle was about like that. And it was made out of plexiglass, and it had to raise up, tilt back, and then there's a targeting band on it that the mirror that tilts back is mounted on, and it had to be able to swing back and forth, and there's a little targeting sensor box that had to have a little light that would light up showing target was locked. The whole thing was made out of plexiglass and wood and styrene and foam. And it was built by me and another really great guy named Ron Thornton, who was a big name model maker later, and he had originally came from England. And that was my first start. My big first feature film was Real Genius, was doing those sequences for the movie. The B-1 bomber that's at the end was a model kit. Luckily, there was a big model kit of it made at the time that was over 3 feet long, but we had to make it so it could be used for motion control photography. And to do so, usually there'll be a steel or aluminum armature inside the model, so it can be mounted to the motion control system and be really sturdy. And you want to have the model be able to be mounted from more than one point. And from looking at the storyboards of what they wanted the shots to look like, we determined that there should be a mount in the tail and in the nose, and one in the center of the belly and one in the center of the top of the airplane. I made all the hatches removable with magnets so they would just lock on to the steel pole that we put through the center of it. Same thing with the landing gear, same thing with the landing gear doors, same thing including the bomb bay doors, so that we could use one model to do all these things without having to hinge and motorize all these other things, because it wasn't necessary. And then also I had to build a miniature of the laser pod that would come down out of it. And to do so accurately, I got sent down to set to see the real full-size one, and they filmed most of the principal photography of all the interiors was filmed at what's now called Hollywood Center Studios. At the time, it was Francis Ford Coppola's Zoetrope Studios, and then he eventually sold it. But now it's called Hollywood Center Studios. So that was my big first feature film, and I really enjoyed that movie, and I still, whenever I see it, it still brings a chuckle, because I love watching all the little things we did for that movie.
People are asking, what is the most challenging prop you ever built and why?
Oh, that's a hard question, because there's been a lot of things that have been very challenging. But really, I would have to say the single most challenging was probably the Carousel Hat in Beetlejuice, because it had to do so many things, and yet it had to be worn by a person, and worn by a person who is a comedian and may not necessarily understand the limitations of what they're dealing with in wearing this prop. When we built the Carousel Hat, when I built the Carousel Hat, it was done over at Bob Schwartz's shop, where you and I were working on Beetlejuice at the time. And Tim Burton and his art director, Rick Heinrich, came and had a meeting with us, and they gave me drawings of what the Carousel Hat was meant to look like. Now, originally, the Carousel Hat was going to be red and white, not black and white as we see, but because they wanted to have it more of a circus feel, but they decided for whatever reason to change it, and it became black and white. And if anybody is familiar with Tim Burton's art style, really wonderful, wacky drawings, but his sketches don't lend themselves well to understanding what is this I'm supposed to be building. And so we had this long meeting where I'm asking him, what does it do? How is it going to be used? Who's going to wear it? And you just start asking all these questions, because they determine your technique of what you're going to build it out of. How durable does it need to be? What kind of abuse is it going to take? And you still have to design it around making it comfortable for the actor who's going to wear it. Michael Keaton's not really wearing it on his head. We had a bust of his, a casting of his head from down to here, about just below the shoulder line. And I took a bar of aluminum strap, and I heated it up, and I very carefully bent it to the back of his head, to the shoulders, and then we made a harness so he could wear it on his shoulders. So it's actually strapped on around his chest and over his shoulders. So all the weight is really on his shoulders, and it just barely rests on his head. And also, they originally wanted the Carousel Hat to unfold like an umbrella as it's coming up. And we determined we could not make the mechanical one do everything he wanted and be able to fold up. And to do things easier, we decided we would make two of them. You were given the job of making the fold-up one like the umbrella, and then I was given the job of making the fully mechanical one. And most people, a lot of times, they don't notice because they didn't shoot close-ups of it, but the Carousel Hat is spinning. All the little monsters on it are going up and down as the carousel spins. There's a pair of bat wings on the side that are flapping in and out. And way up at the top, there's a little tiny skull that looks very much like Jack Skellington in Nightmare Before Christmas, but this is still years before that happens, who's at the very top, and there's a little bat sitting on his head, and that had to stay still while all of this other stuff is going on around him. As well as there's 550, I think, light bulbs all wired in place into it to give it that real circus carousel look. One of the other problems and difficulties in doing it is that the carousel monsters all had to perfectly face the same direction as they're going around. Well, that's perfectly easy on a real carousel because there's a bottom for it to be attached to. With them just hanging, I had to devise a way of getting them to continue facing forward, so they would always face forward in their trip round while they're still going up and down. And when I first made my first attempt, I used cylindrical tubing that interfit like a car antenna, so it would slide up and down. Problem was the round shape also let them rotate like it was an axle, and the creatures would turn different directions, and that wasn't going to work. So I thought of the idea that I would use hexagon-shaped brass interfit tubing, because the hexagon being, shaped with corners is going to keep them facing the same direction. And because of the fact that we painted them, and then, with the stripe, from the camera, you can't tell the difference between a tube and a hexagon. So that was one problem solved. And then there's a piece of fishing line cording that's going up from the monster. The monsters were sculpted by this wonderful sculptor named Linda Frobost. And then our casting people, we had to cast them out of a super lightweight material because we wanted to keep down the weight because of the mechanism needing to pull these things up. And then there was a line of this braided fishing line up to the top, and there was a little bell crank. And that bell crank is going up and down because it's mounted to a wheel, and the wheel is mounted to an axle, and the axle is going to the center of the carousel. So as the motor is spinning this disc of plexiglass that everything is mounted to, the motor is spinning the disc. The wheel is attached to the disc. As the disc rotates, that wheel is picking up the motion, transmitting it through a long axle to a little bell crank at the end. So as the disc is turning, the wheel spins, making the little bell crank go up and down, and that bell crank is pulling up on the thread. All at the same time, all of this, and then there's, I think, 8 of them? I can't remember. And yeah, and then there's also a commutator disc. A commutator is 2 pieces of conductive material with 2 little feelers so that electricity can be passed up to the feelers, and then it gets put onto the disc, and then there's another pair of feelers to take the electricity off of it, which is then going up to all the lights. So we're having to pass electricity through a spinning disc so that the light bulb can stay lit. So that was an awful lot of work, and especially when I only had 2 months to engineer and build the whole thing and test it to make sure it would work. And then when we took it to set, it worked fine. We did have one minor little incident where Michael Keaton forgot himself, and he turned his head backwards, like this. And the carousel hat was already spinning in motion this way, and the counter rotation of his head stripped the gears. Luckily, I had thought about this just in case, and the motor assembly was made modular. So all we had to do was undo 4 screws, unplug it from power, and replace it. And luckily, even though he did break it accidentally, we were able to replace it because it happened just before lunchtime. And so we spent lunchtime fixing it so it would be ready to go back. And then when we came back from lunch, everything worked fine. All that work, 2 months worth of work for about maybe an hour's worth of use.
What is the process on Star Trek from getting a design from the art department until you were finished with the single project?
Well, the biggest thing to consider with anything being done for TV is time. On Star Trek, on almost every single one of the Star Trek shows we did is time. We usually would have no more than a week, 5 days, maybe a week to build something. And we would get usually a three-quarter view and maybe a profile of the object. And they would tell us it needs to be 7 inches long, whatever, And it's time. Time, how is it going to be used? Is it going to be thrown? Is it going to be dropped? Is it just going to be picked up like a hypo? Is it just going to be picked up and used? So you have to then decide on how is it going to be built based on how it's going to get used. In an episode of Deep Space Nine, the episode where Jake Sisko's father, Captain Sisko, gets lost in a time warp, and all because of this thing that Jake Sisko was supposed to hand him. We knew the script called for it to get dropped. And so you and I made the decision, we got to make this really sturdy because we're going to drop it, and not just once, but a whole bunch of times. So we made the whole thing out of aluminum. It was an aluminum tube with aluminum handles and some brass fittings and such. The only parts that were plastic were a couple of little covers that we made where there were some LEDs. Other than that, it was all metal. But again, same time schedule. You still have only like a week to build it. So it's all those things you have to look at.
Do you have a favorite Star Trek prop that you have built?
There's so many. I think my favorite Star Trek prop that I built would probably be the phaser rifles from Star Trek First Contact. John Eves did an awesome design, and it was a pleasure and an honor to get to build something of his. But again, a case of time, because we needed to make, I think it was like 15 of them. for that film. And then that's not even including the stunt ones we had to make, which then there's a whole nother process for making the stunt objects. So it was decided to get broken up by different people. One of our other co-workers, Bear Burge, was given the task of making the nose. And this was the square, what we call the square nose version. And then I was given the task to make the center portion. Then I also ended up having to take over the job of making the back portion. Somebody else had been hired to make the back portion. They insisted on doing it their own home shop. And when it was brought in, it was just not right. It didn't fit the rest of the parts, and it didn't fit the mechanism for the seatbelt retraction. And so I then ended up spending the weekend fixing it to making it right. So basically, I did the middle portion and the back portion of the gun, including then making the one and only that went to camera, the one that you see Picard working on, where he's working on its guts, and he's got a panel of it pulled out. I like to jokingly refer to that one as the works in a drawer, because the part literally slides out like a drawer. And so that was probably my favorite one, because it's cool to see them carrying around these badass looking phaser rifles.
What's the one prop you had to make that was just not going as planned?
Probably the Breen helmets from Deep Space Nine. It was just, we had to make 6 of them. And again, we had a week's time to make them. And Bob Blackman is an amazing costume designer. He was so nice and giving of his time. He actually came out to the shop several times, first to give me the drawings, because he had an errand to come out this way anyway. And he said, he looked at me, he could tell when I saw the drawings, I didn't like them. And he said, yeah, I know, I don't like it either, but that's what production wants, so that's what we have to give production. People don't realize many times we don't have any say over the design, or, we're given drawings. Our job is to make somebody else's design and artwork and vision real. Very rarely are we given the task of getting to design something up. So, had to make the helmets. It was decided I would sculpt them very quickly out of hard foam, take a piece of hard, rigid foam, sculpt it. Then you could vacuum form over it with a thin layer of plastic, some styrene usually. Leave the thin layer of styrene on it, and then go back and puncture it where you wanted the plastic to draw down over it. Then spray your brand new sculpture, what we call the buck or the pattern, with airborne Vaseline, so that now you could then go back over it and vacuum form over it with a thicker, sturdier piece of plastic. And because you use the airborne Vaseline, a little talcum powder, the new stuff isn't going to stick to the old stuff. And that's how we made all 6 Breen helmets. I got word literally like 2 days before they were going to go to set. Oh yeah, Kira's going to have a fight. We want to have her have the fight. And then at the end of the fight, we want her to pull off the face mask, revealing, don't shoot, it's me. All is one shot. And I'm like, oh, great. It's one thing. It would have been fine just to do it as a shot where you just see her pulling it off. But
just as a note, also the other reason is because the actor who plays Ducat is claustrophobic,
and he didn't tell anybody until the last minute. So we couldn't. All the other people wearing the helmets, we had little screws in theirs. But the 2 helmets, one for the actor playing Gul Dukat, Mark Anselmo, I believe, and then for Kira Nerys, for Nana Visitor, because the action called for her to pull hers off, and because he was claustrophobic, I had to put magnets in them. So I used some very powerful neodymium rare earth magnets so that she could pull it off at the end of her fight and reveal herself, and so that he could just take his helmet off quickly since he was claustrophobic. And because of them being so touchy, I ended up going to set to basically babysit them. So all the scenes of them wearing the Breen armor that they've stolen and the helmets, I was there watching and babysitting everything on set. And I believe that episode was shot and directed by LeVar Burton. He was really great to work with. He was like, sorry we had to do this to you on the last minute, but...
How do you describe what you do?
I guess in the simplest terms, what I do is that I make other people's visions, creativity real. But I make them real within the constraints of time, budget, and functionality. As a prop maker and as a costume maker, that's what I would say, how I would describe in simplest terms what I do.
The prop work on Star Trek is exceptional, seems nearly unmatched on other shows, not just in quality of design. Why do you think Trek props stand out much more than other shows or films?
I think it starts from the top. All the people working in production at Star Trek, Rick Sternbach, John Eves, so many of these other people like us, they're fans. They love Star Trek. They want to produce the coolest stuff for Star Trek they can. So they would give it all their extra effort in the design process. And then people like you, like me, like Steve Horsch, like almost everybody who worked at our shop, we also love Star Trek. And we wanted to make it the best we can for the time and the money we have. I think that's the reason why the stuff from Star Trek just really stands out, because people care more, because we all have that connection to loving Star Trek.
Do you collect props?
Not really. I have a few things of my own, things I worked on, but no, I'm not I have to have this version tricorder, that version tricorder, this and that. I don't, I really don't. I still have, to this day, a classic Trek tricorder kit that was given to me by our dear departed friend, Steve Horsch. I still have it sitting in a box because fans, love them dearly, but they don't understand. We're at the shop all day, and a day for us, it's not uncommon to be there 9, 10, 12 hours, including the weekends. And so when you go home, all you want to do is relax. And after you've spent all that time building props all day, the last thing you want to do is go home and make them more.
If you didn't become a prop maker, what do you think your career path would have been?
I'm pretty certain of this, a toy maker, because I love toys. I collect toys still. I'm 60 years old and I still collect toys. And
So you are a collector.
Of toys, yes. I don't have to make them. And I did work in the toy industry for 10 years, working for both Lennard Toys as well as Mattel, making toys. We made, at your shop, you and me and Steve and the rest of the crew, we made those awesome 4 different play sets for Mattel.
6.
Oh, was it 6 play sets? See, even I forget. And those were awesome play sets, which we as an outside vendor built for Mattel because their people couldn't do it as quickly as we could.
6 days, 6 models.
6, and these are what we call works-like play sets. They're not just one little model. It was a whole play set. I remember mine was like this whole muscle car play set where you could put the car up on a rack and put it on a dynamometer as well as make it do loops and all these things. And it worked. In the toy industry, they are normally given a couple of months to build something like that.
What is a dream project prop that you would love to work on?
Something that's already been built? Or something I want to build?
Something that you would love to be involved with making.
Oh boy. Well, right now, I would love to be working on The Mandalorian because that show is badass. Everything about that show is just awesome. The writing, the design of the vehicles, the characters, the costumes, it's just awesome. But then I have a private project of my own I've been working on ever so slowly for many years. And I finally began to work on it more steadily, and that's a full-size Lost in Space robot. I love that robot. I know it's goofy. I know it's 60s, but I don't care. I love that robot. When I was a little kid, when I was in junior high school and high school, I had the Viewmaster wheels, and I had a Viewmaster projector. And I used that projector so I could project the image of the robot full size onto my sliding closet door, which was white at the time. And much to the consternation of my mom, I drew a full-size drawing of the robot, or at least what I thought was full-size, not knowing for sure. And from that, even when I was in high school, I started making one. I got rid of course. And so I've always wanted that. So that's kind of like my own dream project to work on for myself.
As prop makers are, quote, aging out / retiring, and the new generation is coming in, what do you think, are they just not wanting to do the same things? This is a really weird question.
Oh, no, I understand where you're going with it. I think the biggest problem is that they've become compliant in letting this wonderful tool of the computer do everything for them. And I've seen people make things and they talk about, oh yeah, it took me, 16 hours to print this. And it's this tiny little hand prop thing. And I'm like, I could have had that done in 8 hours. Why are you so afraid to just get your hands dirty and make something with your own hands? Because it's just like the computer. The computer, I don't hate them. I think 3D printing is awesome, but it all has its place. And in our business, it's time. If I could never have let somebody waste 16 hours printing that when I could have just done it myself in 8. Okay, yeah, you can say that's 16 hours. It's just doing it. I could be doing something else. But many times on one little prop, you need that prop so you can then make other parts that are going to fit to it.
Or make a mold.
And make the mold, exactly. So I think the biggest problem with prop makers and model makers coming up is don't use the computer as such a crutch, because you may find yourself in a position, if you try to work in the business professionally, where that's not going to work out. That's great if you have a couple of days or more just to make the pattern master, but work like what we've had to do, and the business isn't going to change. The business, the industry, the effects industry doesn't care that you can make something that's totally bitchin' in 16 hours when they just need it done. It's going to be seen on camera for a minute. It just needs to be there. The 8-hour version will be just as good. So the business isn't going to change just because you think you can do it on a printer. You have to have all of those skills. You have to be able to build it by hand. You also have to be able to do it on a computer. I think that's the biggest problem, being too reliant on machinery instead of being able to still do things by hand.
So what you're saying is you think that anyone who wants to be a prop maker should at least know how to build something before they get to the computer.
Oh, most definitely, yeah.
So that you know that
most definitely.
If you're going to have an axle on something, that the axle needs clearance in the hole that you're going to be making in the prop.
Exactly. One of the things I learned on early from other people who had already done this before me, I'm good friends with Bill George, very famous model maker who worked many years up at ILM. He started off as a physical model maker like the rest of us, and then he slowly transformed into doing computer-aided design building for model making, including renders for doing visual effects, CGI shots. And he said, learning how to build something by hand makes the transition to doing it with the computer so much easier, because you understand what does it mean to have these angles and shapes, and how do they interact with each other? How is that going to lay flat on a flat plane as compared to just trying to figure it out and having no idea how things are made in the real world? So I think being able to make models by hand and props by hand will only help you into learning how to do it with the computer.
So what is the true definition in the film industry of a prop maker?
Well, I would have to say the true definition, in my opinion, of what a prop maker is, and I've been doing this for 30 years, a real prop maker makes the object from scratch, whether they're drawing it on the computer and then printing it out, or if they're then completely making an object from scratch. When I go and take raw materials, whether it be sheets, styrene or plexiglass or aluminum or even wood or whatever, and I'm cutting and fitting and making these pieces and putting it together, I am making the object. To simply take a resin casting of something that's been molded, that's not a builder. That's an assembler. You're finishing. It's like going to a hobby shop and buying a model kit. I assembled the model kit, but I didn't build it. I didn't do all the tooling involved in making those parts. A machine injection molded those parts, and I'm now assembling and painting and finishing it. That's different. A real model maker can do it from scratch. You're starting from scratch to build a prop or a model.
Someone looking to become a prop maker, what would you recommend that they do as far as schooling or learning to achieve this goal?
Well, you have to be very versed in lots of different artistic schooling, like being able to paint something, being able to sculpt something, being able to make molds of something, knowing how to operate a table saw, a lathe, a bandsaw, knowing how to do all of these varied tasks that you and I take for granted because after all of our years of experience, because we all started off as hobbyists and we learned all these skills and we got better and better with all these skills. So I would say you need to start there in learning how, knowing color theory, knowing that if I mix this color and that color, I'm going to get another color. Many times we would have to custom make paint for painting things. And then, depending on what's called out for the object. And I think that something's really important for people to learn to get into this business is that you're making something for someone else. You have to learn to divorce your own ego over the object to make what they want. I love making stuff and I want to make something as good a quality as possible. But in the end, I'm making something that's somebody else's vision, not mine.
What was something they thought would be incredibly easy to do and ended up being a huge pain?
Oh my goodness. There's so many. Which one do I pick? The Carousel white tubes on Deep Space Nine. It looks really simple. It's just a clear plexiglass tube with a stopper. But then when you put in the design that they're now bent at angles, just makes it so much harder. And especially when you consider that I must have made 20 or maybe even 30 of those things. So to make things go faster, you then have to be thinking about, I need to make a fitting jig. And I had learned how to make jigs when I worked in aerospace, because I worked in aerospace for almost 5 years after graduating from high school while I was putting myself through college. And so I made a jig so that I could take a piece of the plexiglass tubing, place it in the jig, and the jig was made to fit. Most bandsaws have a slot in them, so as a guide, so you make things nice and parallel. And I made the jig so it would have a bar underneath it so it would fit into the slide on the bandsaw. And that way I could predictably always cut the same angle for the bottom of the tubing, and then have another jig for then cutting the middle angle and then the top of it, and then fitting them together. I had a jig so I could hold them all together and then just put glue on them. I didn't have to worry about holding them all together, and that way I could make so many of them all at one time. And on top of that, they still have to look really nice and clear. You can't have any glue drips or smears or smudges or scratches. So they look really simple, and they're not. And I still have one that I got to keep for myself, and it's still keeping the fluid in it. And on top, I had to come up with a way of making a stopper. We used little tiny O-rings that were fitted into the top, the gray, the metallic gray part, so you could really put them in. So those were way harder than they looked.
Who were some of the other artists that influenced you?
Oh, that's actually pretty easy. Number one would be Greg Jean. Greg Jean, an incredibly talented. First time I ever met Greg was at a convention way back in the 70s, I think maybe 78, 79. And I had a model kit that I had assembled, the Millennium Falcon, that was in the art show at the convention. And he just happened to be there, and I recognized him from seeing him in magazines. And I got the courage up and I went up to him and I talked to him and asked him about my model. And I said, don't bullshit me, just tell me the truth. What do you think of it? What could I do better? And he said, well, overall, I think you did a really good job. The only thing I would change is maybe You have to think about the scale of the model, and your weathering is a little bit heavy for the scale. If this was a bigger model, the heavier weathering would be okay. And I really liked that honesty, because I told him I wanted to do this professionally and I wanted to be the best I could. And I'm not going to be able to be the best if I don't know how to fix things, if I've done something wrong. And so Greg's always been a huge inspiration to me. I mean, he got his start working on low-budget pictures like Flesh Gordon. He built a bunch of the spaceships and such for that. And then he rose up and he did all of the model effects. He was in charge of the model crew on Spielberg's 1941 and on Close Encounters. He built the bleeding mothership, in Close Encounters. So Greg has always been a huge inspiration to me.
Have you ever built something solely for your own amusement and then it got used in production?
Yes, actually. Way back, I'm going to say the late 90s or so, I was working at a shop and they were having to make a bunch of creature heads for some sort of private party event involving the NBA. I don't remember why, but it was the Cantina Band characters. Well, I had already made one of the instruments. Not exactly, but you look at it and it really had the feeling of, you looked at it and you go, oh, okay, yeah, I recognize what this is meant to be. And I'd just done it for myself. I made it in one evening, and it was made from one trip to the hardware store. The main body was a piece of PVC pipe and a bunch of brass valve fittings and some, copper tubing that I put around it. And you let me take a couple of castings off of parts of one of the Borg arm pieces we had laying the molds around, and I slightly laid them so that they would fit onto the ends of the tubing. So I made this, Cantina Band member, like big saxophone-like device. And they mentioned that they had to make instruments, but they didn't have enough time to do them. And I mentioned, hey, I've got this one here. And so my supervisor at the time said, oh, great, would you mind renting it to us? I said, sure, I'll rent it to you guys. But I want it back, and I want one of the cantina heads also in exchange. And I did. I rented it to them. I got paid for it, as well as I got to keep one of the cantina heads, and I still have it.
What is the stress level on working on a schedule as fast as Star Trek?
Oh, it can be really, really heinous. It's very stressful. It is not a job that I would recommend to people who can't handle stress. As you and I both know, we would regularly get into the shop at 9, which some people might think of, oh, that's banker hours, 9 o'clock. And yeah, and we're there till 9 p.m. And that's a regular thing we would be doing.
Or later.
Or much later. I mean, when we were working on Deep Space Nine, and you had gotten early on a design for a Klingon dagger. And you had spoken with the prop master about it, and you gave him a price, a very fair one. He said, well, I'll use something else. That's a little high for me. I'll use something else I already have, and I'll just repaint it. And it's like, well, great. That's your decision. And then 5 days later, he calls back up and says, the production really likes this, and they're willing to pay for it. And then you had to have a very firm meeting about it with him, saying, no, we can still make it for you, but now it's going to be a lot more money because now we have to do it overnight. And so since I was kind of the Klingon expert, I was given the task to make this dagger, which we gave the name the Soul Taker. And the blade is one piece of T-65 aircraft aluminum, cut with all these fluted shapes. I had to use a Dremel and engrave into the blade Klingon symbols and all this stuff. And then the handle was all handmade out of sheet acrylic with dental acrylic to bond everything together, and then using a Dremel to shape it. And I made the whole bloody thing in one night. And then it was getting very late at the night, and I was running out of time. And there was, at the end of the knife, there's this big, what I believe is called a pummel ball. And it was very beautiful, very decorative, but there was no time for me to scratch build it out of nothing. And I'm looking around the shop thinking, what can I use? What can I use? And I saw over on one of the other guys' desk, he had a glass bottle, exactly like the type used in Ijrimagini, but it wasn't painted. But he had a mold for the top, the stopper, and I thought, that's it. I can use that. It's round, it's very decorative. I took a casting of it. What's normally the tip of the bottle topper, I cut it off and I put a bolt through it, and then the other end where the stopper would be, I cut that end off flat and I glued a small plexiglass dome onto it. And then the part that I put the screw in, I threaded that into the back end of the dagger, so I painted it all up. This is also one of those cases where I got to work in little hidden things. There was little Easter eggs in it. Mike Akuda in the graphics department had given me a sheet telling me this is A, this is B, and such, and for the whole Klingon language, the written that they had worked out. So I said, okay, I'm going to use that. And so I changed the glyphs that were in the drawing, because really the glyphs in the drawing was gobbledygook. It didn't make any sense. So I changed them. On one side of the blade, it has my initials, MC, and on the other side of the blade, it has the initials PE for Proper Effects, your company. And on the blade, on the handle, there are all the other people in the shop's initials are on the handle. So unless you ever got to see a casting up close, you'd never see that all these other handles, the handle has all the other initials, but everybody's is there. And I got it all done, very bleary-eyed. I even had to deliver it to set. And the only reason I agreed to that is that at the time, I was living in West Hollywood, and Paramount is in Hollywood proper. So going from where the shop was at the time here in North Hollywood back home, it wasn't too far for me to go by Paramount and drop it off before I went home. And I had it done. I'm there on the set at 7 in the morning. And mind you, I've been awake all night. I started making this thing at about 10:30, 11 in the morning. I've been there all night, crazily drinking Mountain Dew to keep myself awake all night. I get it done. I deliver it to set. I hand it to the prop master. He looks it over. He goes, okay. He puts it down and he walks off. Not even so much as a thank you after all that time. So you really have to bite your tongue when people treat you rudely like that, because it can affect your job. It can affect your reputation. And I just bit my tongue about it, you know. But I was like, wow, that really taught me. There's a lot of stress involved. And that's just one of many, many cases of having to deal with the stress.
What's the most unusual household item you have turned into a prop?
I remember we were working for Ian. I can't remember his last name now. And
was it Sequest or Space Above and Beyond?
I think it was Sequest. And I had to take this lint brush and I made it into some sort of magnetic scanner. So I took it, it had a rectangular head, and I removed that. And then I took a piece of plexiglass, and I made a piece of plexiglass to replace it to fit. And then I had to put wires in it and a battery pack inside it. And so there'd be a switch here where you could turn it on, and where there'd be a couple of LEDs up here, as well as there was several LEDs in the head of it, so that you'd pick it up, put it against the person, and turn it on. And it would cast this nice, cool glow of light onto the person, so you could then be using it as if it's some sort of scanner, looking for something. I don't remember what it was. I just remember, this is really funny. I'm making a piece of scientific equipment out of a lint brush.
Have you ever had any disastrous experiences while creating a prop?
Oh, gosh, yes. Just a couple of years ago, not Trek related, I was working at a different shop, and we were given the task to make a full-size sculpture of a person, clear, and they wanted lights, LED lights inside it, and so they could change the colors of the lights. But the clients insisted we use specific materials, a specific silicone, a specific casting material to make the clear parts. And we did exactly as they asked, but for whatever reason, their silicone they insisted we use did not like this clear casting resin. The parts came out badly. Not only that, but even the mold did not like the casting material, and it was just an utter disaster. And I had spent a week making this mold, because it was like the elbow of a person's arm. It was from the arm, from the shoulder down to the wrist, and we had the bend of the elbow, and there was clothing sculpted onto it. And it had to be hollow so we could then pass the wiring for all the LEDs that were going to be hung inside it. And they didn't want to be able to see the LEDs or the wiring as well through these clear castings. And it was just a giant disaster. And thank God we only made the one demo arm piece. Luckily, my supervisor, he had the will, and he basically told the clients, sorry, if this is how you insist we do it your way, then we can't do this. And we just said, sorry, see you later. No, we're not going to deal with this, because they wanted a full-size human sculpture. If we're having this much trouble just making an arm, imagine how it would have been for a whole thing.
How was your relationship with the designers?
Oh, usually really great. I mean, that was one of the best parts about working on the different Star Trek shows with John Eves and Rick Sternbach and Carl Martin and Richard Delgado, is that they didn't mind if we changed things a little bit here and there.
Jim Martin.
I'm sorry, Jim Martin. With John Eves and Jim Martin and Rick Sternbach and Richard Delgado. They were wonderful because they understood our task and how difficult it was. And they didn't mind if we changed things here and there a little bit to make it work better, because they don't have the time to work out how this is going to do, because they don't normally even are told, you know. So no, working with all those people was wonderful. Even like when you know, other projects, for the most part, the production end understands the limitations of time and what we've got to work with. So they're usually really good about working with us.
How do you feel when you go to a convention and you see people replicating your work for cosplay?
Well, I take it different ways. If they have honestly built the object completely on their own, from scratch, from just looking at photographs or watching video and everything, I feel kind of honored that they liked something I built so much that they wanted to build one for themselves. And then there's the other hand. If they simply bought a casting from someone that's a knockoff off of my original work, I'm not so much of a fan of that, because many times, and I've seen this happen, I've encountered this because I've been to lots and lots of conventions as a guest and whatnot, and I'll see somebody and I'll ask them, oh, that's really nice. Did you make that? And I know for a fact that they didn't, because I know it's a casting off of one of mine. And they very cheerfully said, oh, yes, I did it all myself. You know, aren't I a good little boy? And then again, I don't say anything because it's not my place. I'm at a convention. It's a public event. I don't want to ruin their good time. But on the other hand, it makes me upset. I think the ones who make me the most upset are the ones who have made a career and a business out of reproducing our work and making a lot of money off of it, when we hardly got paid for them all, to the point that I see on prop groups where people call what we would call the object, and they give it the name of the person who's replicating it. I don't want to say any of these people's names because I don't want to give them publicity, because they don't deserve it. But it really pisses me off to see these people's, their names get attached to my hard work, your hard work, other people's hard work, and they're reproducing it and selling it and making money off of it. I had an incident just recently, something I had designed for myself, my own design for something that was meant to be based off of something from Next Generation. And this person was openly making copies of it. And I confronted the person. I said, look, I would really prefer if you not made reproductions. This is my own design. It wasn't made for the show. Somebody from the show didn't design it. Because if you're reproducing their stuff, I don't have any say. It's not mine. I don't own it. Paramount owns it. This person refused to acknowledge the fact that I had a right to protect my own design. And when I finally said, look, I don't want you reproducing it, he counter-offered and saying, how about if I pay you for half of them? And I said, I don't have any way of knowing you're going to be honest with me. So no, the answer is no. And after that, he eventually just said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And wow. And I finally said to him, my last thing I said to him was, think about it. If somebody else was reproducing your design of something, your own original design with it, would you be so okay to let somebody else steal from you? Because that's what it is. It's theft. And he never answered, which means he had no comeback. He had no answer. but he's perfectly okay to steal from me. That's a 3-tiered answer.
This is a kind of a trick multi-question type of thing is, what do you make props and or masters out of?
It depends on what the object is going to be. Like if the object needs to be hollow and fairly durable, I like to go vacuum formed because, you know, styrene or ABS is incredibly durable. You can glue to it, you can cut it, you can paint it easily. But if the object is small and is going to be solid, I'll make the original out of plexiglass. I love working in plexiglass. I did that Jem'Hadar hand pistol for Deep Space Nine. It was a beautiful design. I really liked it. I liked the center portion where all these little pipes were and everything. And I made the whole thing out of solid plexiglass. I like working in plexiglass. You and I, we got the idea before I painted it, primered it, and we took some pictures of it all clear. And it's really cool to see it all clear. And so it depends on the object. Like that pistol, I did it all out of plexiglass because I like working in plexiglass. I remember making a bomb case, like a toolbox case thing for O'Brien for an episode of Deep Space Nine. And we did it vacuum formed because of its shape. It needed to be lightweight. It needed to be open, be able to open to put things in. And then I made the handle out of solid plexiglass so it would be durable. Sometimes, depending if the object is meant to look like wood, we'll make it out of real wood. Like when you made the Horgon, you made it all hand carved out of wood and then molded because that way you had the natural grain there. You didn't have to sculpt it in place. It's already there. So it depends. Depends on the object and how is it going to get used. If it's going to get thrown about and broken or dropped, yeah, you might want to build it out of something more durable, out of metal. If it's going to be a stunt object, then there's a whole other process for making something as a stunt object.
Do you have any fun stories about interacting with cast members?
Oh, yes. Some of them are stories from when I got to work on Next Generation as an extra, and some of them are working on the show as a prop maker. On Deep Space Nine, when we were called upon to make all of the gold pressed latinum bars, that was a lot of fun because I really thought the idea of their money was really funny and, well, not funny, but cool. I liked the design of it. But again, the weird alien writing of it, it didn't make any sense. We don't know what language it's supposed to be. And I got the idea and I changed the weird glyphs on it. The bar is meant to be held this way, like a phone. But if you turn it sideways, you kind of squint, you can see the weird alien writing becomes letters, English letters. So I put, mine was the smaller of the bars, and I dremeled the shapes in basically engraving it into the plexiglass. And I put my name and my first partner Scott's name on it. And it's for Scott Adams, not Scott Brodeen, as some people have thought. Scott's a friend of ours who had worked with us on the show, but it was not for him. It was for my husband at the time. You did the next size up bar, and you put, no, I put your name, Mike's name, and Shauna's name into that one.
No, I did that.
Right. And that's right, because we didn't engrave it.
Bear did the first one.
Yeah.
I did the second one.
And then I did the smallest one. And you decided to do the letters out of tape because it was faster instead of having to engrave it. And for me, doing the letters out of tape would not have worked well because it's so small. And then the biggest bar says Bear and Dana on it, which was for his girlfriend. And so that was a lot of fun, especially when the show had already been shooting for over a year. The prop master came back and said, "What's with these things? I can see people's names on them." And we kind of say, well, you've been working with them every day up close, and you're just barely noticing this a year later. Nobody at home can see that. It's just a fun little side thing, just like the way that when you made the Bajoran orb case, you guys carved funny little things into the stuff. Wasn't it your idea to carve the no-kill eye, or not? No, it was not Indy's arc.
And no kill.
Yeah, and no kill eye are both on the Bajoran orb case, which are both funny little Easter eggs that nobody would see unless they saw an original up close.
Exactly. Here's a question from Rick Sternbach.
Oh boy.
How have electronics for handheld props evolved from 9-volt or button batteries and LEDs in the from the 80s to today?
Oh my God, the advances in electronics is so amazing. You can do so much more than we could back at the time. I remember starting off, we had to use just incandescent light bulbs because this was before LEDs. The Carousel Hat in Beetlejuice, those are all real grain of wheat light bulbs. Incandescent light bulbs. Now we'd have done it with LEDs. And then as things progressed, on Next Generation, when we were doing the tricorders, those were all LEDs, very few light bulbs, but they were bigger and they used a lot more energy. And a circuit board to make something as simple as a little 4 count on the tricorder, count through the different phases of the scannings it was going through, that circuit board was a lot bigger. And I remember we had to use that old-fashioned, what they called, I think, a J battery.
J-cell.
A J-cell, which is a flat kind of rectangular cell, which had this one little cut off of one corner on this rectangle. And we had to hide the J-cell in the lower portion of the tricorder, and the upper portion was all hollow so that we could fit the LEDs and the circuit board and everything else. And that took up a lot more room. And then as things progressed, like on the later tricorders that you and Steve designed, we vacuum formed the bodies out of clear PTG because then we didn't have to cast them. Then we didn't have to drill holes for putting all the LEDs through. And the clear vacuum formed bodies, we could just glue the LEDs literally to the inside and not ever have to cut any more holes again. And the circuit boards were, so much smaller, and all of the battery packs could fit inside the main body, and you could just get more into them and get them to do more and interesting things.
In the process of making new props for Star Trek, how much did we have to stick to the drawing, or could we change things?
We had to stick to the drawings pretty closely. It was very rarely that we were allowed to change things, and only basically, like a lawyer presenting his case, you present your case. Well, I need to change XYZ because of this. Battery won't fit here like you want it to. We need to have a channel up here to run wires to get a light where you want it. So it would, we were given some latitude, but for the most part, we had to stick as close as we could to the drawing of the prop.
So working in the film industry, what do you think is your greatest creation?
Greatest single creation? Wow, that's hard to say. That's really hard to say because there's been so many really wonderful things I've gotten to build. I would be really hard pressed to pick any one thing. Something I'm really proud about that we got to work on was the Star Trek experience, because I got to work on that in 2 different fronts. The Star Trek experience in Vegas was designed by the Landmark Entertainment Group, headed by Gary Goddard, who we had worked for on Captain Power and Masters of the Universe. And then I went to go work for him at his design company, building theme park design stuff. And while there, I got to work on a lot of really cool stuff. And then just as I was going to be leaving, they started doing the design work. They already had the design work. We were building models of things for the Star Trek experience. And I remember the day that we got this great big box from Paramount Archives, and they uncrate it, and it's the 8-foot model of the Enterprise from Star Trek the Motion Picture. And Star Trek the Motion Picture is my all-time favorite Star Trek movie of the originals. Hands down, it is my favorite. And to get to see that beautiful model up close was amazing, because Landmark was also going to build the big, huge one that hung in the front lobby up above just as you went through the entry gates to the attraction. And so that was amazing to get to work on that. And then getting to figure out things, how parts of the attraction, the ride was going to work. And then going on to work with you and getting then, because of our work with all the props we were doing for the show, all of the props that you see in the Star Trek History of the Future walkthrough attraction, that was all us for the most part. I think we did about 85 to maybe 90% of all the hand props in there. There were some other really big, cool pieces that were made. Like, I know that Greg Jean built the Nomad that was there. And some other people made a few other smaller pieces, but for the most part, we built 85 to 90% of all those hand props that sat there in the museum during all that time. And that was, to me, that was a big thrill, because it was really here you are. I went from being a little kid making my own little hand phaser and pistol phaser out of just junk, and here I've made stuff now which is representative of something I love so much, and it's in a museum. And even after the experience eventually closed, all that stuff went out on a museum tour out all over the United States. And that I love that. I'm very proud of our work we did, both on the shows as well as all that stuff that went out on the museum tour. Because all those other fans got to see that stuff. And I know how happy that makes other people, because I was that same way myself. And so that's a wonderful memory, I think, about that. All that wonderful stuff we did is out there for people to see.
I understand that you're involved with a few Star Trek fan groups.
I have been. Ages ago, I was a member of the Star Trek fan group, the USS Angeles, which is still in effect. They're a club here in Southern California, here in Los Angeles, and I'm still friends with many of the people in that, as well as there's some really wonderful fan groups on Facebook that I'm part of, other different fan groups I'm part of. I have a full-size R2-D2 I built for myself, and I'm a member of the R2 Builders Club and other things like that. I'm, like I said, been working on my own full-size Lost in Space robot. There's a Lost in Space robot B9 Builders group on Facebook, And I think one of the things I like best about these sort of clubs, whether they be physical clubs or internet clubs and such, is that you're really just there to enjoy the same thing. We like making cool stuff for ourselves, especially when it's from a show that we really like and it means something extra special to us. And I like being able to impart my, for lack of a better term, wisdom of all my years of experience in building things and saying, well, that's okay, but this might be a better way for you to think about trying to achieve that goal. It'll save you the heartache of experimentation and failure, because we all learn from experimentation and failure. I learned early on when I was a kid, I can take Bondo and sculpt Bondo and use a Dremel. My single most eureka moment of my young model making and prop making was buying a Dremel and just getting to play with it and see what I could do with it. And I remember a friend wanting to make a Darth Vader costume. And again, this is way back in the 70s. And I thought, well, I've seen pictures of it. He wanted me to help him make the chest box piece. So I took some Bondo and I carved it, and I made one of the rocker buttons, because I lived out in the middle of nowhere and I couldn't get anything like this. So I just made one. And I thought, I don't want to have to make all 4 of them like this by hand. And I thought, wait a minute. I have Vaseline, and Bondo's liquid, and when you put the catalyst to it, it eventually turns solid, and you have about 5 minutes worth of working with it. So I took that first rocker key that I had made, I glued it down to something flat, and I coated it with a Q-tip with Vaseline, because I knew it would stop it from sticking. And then I mixed up a batch of Bondo, and I very quickly, using a popsicle stick, is again, I'm a kid, I'm 17, 18, and I took that Bondo and I coated it over the key that I had made with the Bondo. And I just left it alone, waiting for it to set up and harden. And sure enough, half hour later, when the Bondo was all nice and hardened up, I took a screwdriver and I popped the Bondo that I had poured over that rocker key that I had made, and it came right off. And now I learned I can make my own molds this way. And from there, I then did the same thing in reverse. I coated the inside of it with a little bit of Vaseline so that the new Bondo wouldn't stick to the old Bondo. And I smushed the Bondo in there, and I made it all nice and flat, waited for it to set up, and pulled it out, and there was the keys. So you just have to learn to experiment, and sometimes it's going to fail. And you just have to shrug your shoulder and go, oh, well, and learn from it, and just move on.
Here's the last question.
Dun, dun, dun. Last question.
For all the people out there who want to work in the film industry and or the cosplay community creating their own props, what would you recommend that they do?
I mean, as far as learning how to do so?
Yes. Well, what would you recommend the best way for them to achieve their goals?
Well, they have to learn to experiment on their own. There are lots of great stuff and resources of how to figure out how to do things out there on the internet, but sometimes you don't always find the answer you're looking for. And you just have to be willing to take the knowledge you have and build on that and think about it in a logical manner and think about, if I do this X, Y, and Z, will that get me to where I want and create what I want? And if you plan on doing this as a livelihood, you also then have to think about, I got to do this quickly. You know, production is going to wait around for me to figure out how to do this. And we all build off of our past experiences of figuring out, oh, I have this old trick in my pocket. I can use this trick that I figured out a long time ago for this, or I can do that. And so one skill leads off of another. You have to learn to experiment and be willing to take the risk that it's going to fail. But if you've thought it out, if you thought out the process enough, I've usually found that your failure rate ends up being pretty low. That's the things I would have to suggest. I mean, as far as costumes too, it's like costuming is a whole nother matter, and I've done tons of that as well for myself as well as for in the industry. You have to work fast, you have to think smart, and you have to be careful, because sometimes your materials you're working with, there isn't any more of it. You just can't run out to Joann's, get this fabric again. So you have to be really careful how you use it, because if you ruin it, there's no going back. And there is also many times more than one way, more than one technique to try and achieve the goal you're trying to achieve. Sometimes it might be better suited off if you use some soft foam, like some, L300 to do what you're trying to do, and you're going to cover it with fabric, rather than trying to make something vacuum formed and then covering it in fabric. It depends on what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to try and figure out. But yeah, there's lots of different ways of skinning that cat.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it for this run here. Thank you, Max, for coming to do the interview, and I'm hoping that we have propped up your imagination. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope everybody enjoys this, and of course, live long and prosper. And I do mean propster.